Hi everyone, and welcome to the lecture on Victorian children's literature. This lecture is a little bit longer and covers a wide variety of children's texts from the Victorian time period. For that reason, I encourage you to stop and start the lecture as you go through the different texts, and that way you can think of it as multiple small lectures tied into one large file that you're viewing now. So please be prepared for it to be a little longer than normal, and go ahead and make plans to read the text before you begin. I want us to start out with a quick review of the transition into fantasy during the 19th century so that we can connect it more explicitly to children's literature. So as a reminder, we've been talking about realism versus fantasy and how this competition between the two modes really begins in the Enlightenment era of the 18th century, when that need to separate fact from fiction makes critics and readers devalue fantasy texts. So remember, we're moving away from myth and away from fantasy as being the most important type of narrative for people to read about and talk about, and into realism. Fantasy itself is relegated to non-serious literature. So readers are warned against it because it can lie to them. So because it's not depicting the real world and actual events, people are told that it's less important for their lives. And eventually what happens is that fantasy literature becomes the domain of children's literature. So pure fantasy, again, means fully marvelous. There's no suspense or no questioning about the presence of fantasy or whether the text presents a possible reality. You're clearly in another world. So when you have texts like that, what happens during the 19th century is that those are devalued, still enjoyed for their pleasurable attributes, but not seen as serious literature, and even seen as something that should be warned off, or people should be warned away from. So as fantasy becomes devalued, it becomes the province of children, because children can enjoy it, but it's not something that adults should take seriously. So since fantasy literature is something that adults aren't really supposed to be partaking of, what happens is that it becomes considered a little bit transgressive. So in an age of the 19th century where literature is really used to teach primarily through things like social realism, and where there is a lot of severe anxiety about the changing world, a lot of things changing during the 19th century in terms of industrialization, scientific theories, even genres of literature, with the novel really coming into its own, just a lot of change happening. Fantasy is doing something kind of off in the margins. It's offering an alternative perspective that does not emphasize concrete truth, and it does not focus on that sort of overt moralism that deals with the social realities of the 19th century. And for that reason, it could also be labeled as a little bit dangerous. So fantasy writers themselves felt freed from the obligation to explore social issues, even though many of them did. And if you read some of the texts that we're going to read this week, as well as additional children's literature from the era, what you'll find is that morals are present, and that there's a very specific reason for those morals, because we have to kind of warn people about the difference between fantasy and reality. But for the moment, I want you to think about how fantasy writers, through the use of fantasy, could incorporate imagination and prioritize that in a way that would be very freeing, that it's transgressive from breaking out of the rules of the 19th century, breaking out of the need to always be focusing on social realism and on the restrictions of culture, and kind of explore those things in different ways that would allow imagination to be primary. So focusing on problems of representation, of imagination, of memory, exploring things rather than representing things. That's one of the big differences between fantasy and realism in the 19th century, is that we're not representing what's happening in culture in a one-to-one correspondence, asking readers to look out their windows, as Barrett Browning says, and see what's in the streets and write about that. Instead, it's exploring possibilities. It's opening up different avenues and different perspectives that aren't being seen in culture. And for that reason, it made people slightly uncomfortable and perhaps a little worried about the impact of fantasy, even as it was pushed towards children. So, when we think about children's literature in particular, we have to think about the concept of childhood. And this is going to be a very simplistic overview of how childhood and children's literature and kind of the philosophies between the two were emerging in the 19th century. But again, this is just a starting point as you start to think about and study things like children's literature. So, let's think about how childhood itself is a concept. So, early 19th century, what we see is that there's a redefinition of the way that children were perceived or looked at. Prior to the Romantic era, children were viewed as full of original sin. So what you would think of in terms of the child is that the child is small in stature and young in years, but still had an adult level of sin because of original sin from the Western Judeo-Christian tradition of original sin descending from the biblical stories of Genesis. So children are born with a certain amount of sin. This was, the concept, and in that way, any literature that's directed towards them has to be moralistic because it's supposed to be shaping their character, warning them, lecturing them, making them afraid of the world in certain ways in order to help them conceive of themselves as needing salvation. So children's literature did exist prior to the 19th century, but it looked a lot differently. It would be moralistic pamphlets and things that were grounded in realism and in theological discussions rather than in terms of stories and imagination and even nonsense. So when you get to the 19th century, there's a shift in the way that childhood is viewed. And this isn't just within British literature, but across theories of childhood as well in Europe, as well as in England. So Romantic writers then are starting to look at childhood differently, and they're valuing it as a time of innocence that held this kind of access to pure imagination, and this nostalgia for childhood increases, combined with these theories of children's education, particularly Rousseau's idea that children should be learning with pleasure. And essentially what happens is that you have writers like William Wordsworth who are looking back to childhood and saying, that was the time when we were closest to God, not full of sin, but we're coming directly from heaven. This is Wordsworth's vision in particular. And we're full of this wonder about creation because we're seeing everything clearly, unfiltered, with purity rather than with this heavy emphasis on original sin. And so a lot of these concepts are overturning the way that children, and in fact childhood itself, is conceived. So rather than thinking of children as these kind of mini adults in a child's body, they begin to associate children with this sort of pure innocence that we would maybe see more today in our contemporary definitions of childhood. So this nostalgia for childhood increases, this wish to be able to be a child again, to go back and to inhabit this place of wonder in the child's perspective. You see this come up a lot in Wordsworth's poetry in particular, and this kind of idealization of childhood. Now, there is a difference in different people's poetry. For example, the poetry of William Blake, late 18th century to early 19th century writer, he saw childhood as not being completely idealized, that it should be that way perhaps, but that in fact you had child labor and child workers and children who had a lot more suffering and pain than even many adults did. So there was this dissonance between the idealization of childhood in philosophy and in poetry versus the actual reality of what they were experiencing in their everyday lives. So despite this difference, the concept of childhood is changing. So we're moving away in the 19th century from the idea of childhood as being a time where children need a lot of moral guidance and warnings and lectures and even threats about their behavior, into a time where childhood is seen as precious, something to be protected, something where children should learn with pleasure and have fun and play, and that children should be educated, of course, but they should be done. That should be done in a way that nurtures them and strengthens them through fun and play and imagination, rather than through this kind of more harsh way of addressing them. So when you have this shift in the change of the concept of childhood, combined with the fact that fantasy on a larger scale, even for adults, is being pushed out of the realm of literature and not being marketed to adults, what you have is this sort of perfect storm, because at the same time, culturally, you have a huge increase in the publishing market. And so there's almost universal literacy in the 19th century. Suddenly, children are seen as an audience. So this new interest in preserving innocence and the pleasure of childhood makes authors realize, hey, I can write books and things for them, poetry for them, stories for them that are not just these sort of moralistic tales, but that actually incorporate fantasy and imagination and pleasure in new ways. And what this leads to is a huge boom in children's literature. And really, the creation of children's literature as a market occurs for the first time in the 19th century. Okay, so I know that was probably a lot of dense, fast history and information. So I wanted to give you 2 quick slides that'll help condense some of that into something that's a little more manageable for study in the future. So what I have here is that children's lit before 1800, you need to remember that adults assumed that children were vulnerable to deception when reading, so that there needed to be these warnings and protections for them in order to contain the possibilities of literature and reading so that children would be more morally guided. So the assumption was that children are still trying to determine what is real and not real in the actual world around them, which is true. If anyone knows children or has children, children sometimes don't know the difference between reality and fiction until they learn that through their experience. So when it came to literature, what you're going to see is the development of fantasy prior to 1800. Fantasy was still very strictly guarded and guided. So to protect children, it often included parameters, particularly clear morals at the end, in order to help people understand, well, this was just a fantasy story and here's the point of it. So the literature itself guided towards children. If it was fantasy at all, it's going to be overtly moralistic. Even the character names will be things like Fairy Do Good, to be able to show a child, number one, this is a fake character. There aren't anything such thing as fairies, and you know that because nobody is really named Do Good. And then also the name functions as that moral cautionary warning label to show what's right from wrong and how you're supposed to behave. There were also embedded lectures from the narrator in order to explain what is real and to assuage any type of fears that might be raised by the text. Certain texts would even just have these asides. Now, here, dear child, don't worry about this. Giants aren't real. Even though there's a giant in my story, I want you to know that it's okay because you don't have to be worried right now because giants aren't real. And now back to the story. So these little small things were put into the text to undo the magic, if you will, of the fantasy literature and that imaginative, willing suspension of disbelief that Coleridge talks about as being necessary for imaginative pleasure. It was undoing those things by inserting these moral warnings, the moralism of the names, and these little asides by the narrator in order to keep the child focused on what was real and to warn them off of any bad behavior. Now, what you need to know about the 19th century in comparison to the 18th century is that things in fantasy and children's literature begin to trend away from straight moralism. Although moralistic literature is still extremely popular, and you're going to see that in some of what we read for this lecture. However, there's quite a big difference in the way that fantasy is treated. These narratives incorporate much more sophisticated narratives, and that also has to do with the development of the novel and the short story as a form, and really kind of getting into more sophisticated psychological realism in terms of narratives in general. So children's literature also sees that sophistication come into its narratives as well, and that includes having less intrusive lectures from your narrator. Although again, still sometimes commentary is present, as also happens even in the high realism that's targeted towards adults. So it's not that the narrator won't lecture, it's just that the emphasis begins to be more on humor and playfulness, and eventually, as we see with someone like Lewis Carroll, on nonsense. So there's this increase of pure fantasy, that imaginative pleasure, without expecting the child reader to need so much caution and guidance. And that's the biggest difference that you're going to see, is that as fantasy gets pushed more and more to children's literature, that children's literature really embraces the transgressive properties of what fantasy's potential is in a way that adult literature does not do quite so much. Okay, so with this context in mind, let's take a look at some of the actual literature that was directed towards children. We're going to start with Robert Louis Stevenson, who's really well known more for his novels than for his poetry. He wrote Treasure Island, and he also wrote the story Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which of course is probably his most famous work. We are reading just some of his poems, though, just to give you some context for how there was a little bit of a shift happening in the way that children were addressed. Now, Stevenson's poetry collection is actually one of the most famous to come out of the 19th century because it was directed entirely towards children and marketed towards them. And it's still actually a very popular children's poetry collection that even sells today. In something like Good and Bad Children, you have even more a sense of that dark humor that's coming out that children could be in on, and that could be a way to undo some of the harsh moralism. So you have that kind of dark humor that comes in the second line, your bones are very brittle, right? Imagine saying this to a child, like, think about how fragile you are and how brittle your bones are. You're easily broken, right? So you're weak, and only moralism can save you. But it's a bit of a joke at the same time. It's that dark humor that's coming in. So the idea is, if you want to grow up big and strong, you have to obey all the rules of society. And essentially, even when we get to the fourth stanza, there's this threat of hell, right? Those who are unkind and unruly, those who eat unduly, they can never hope for glory. The hope for glory is to go to heaven. Theirs is quite a different story. Well, what is that story? The story is that they're going to go to hell, right? So there's this kind of threat there of the child's moral soul being taken away if they're not obeying all the rules. But the humor comes in at the end, again, with Stevenson. Cruel children, crying babies, all grow up as geese and gabbies, hated as their age increases by their nephews and their nieces. So the tongue-in-cheek part is, okay, they're not just children who are having this moral problem, but as they grow up, you have in society uncles and aunts who remain childless, which in the Victorian time period is a sign that something went wrong, that you were unmarriageable and couldn't fit into the standard society model. And then you have this kind of, like, they're hated by future children, right? So they turn out to be these villainous people. And the idea of this, again, is a sense of dark humor where the child might be scared of this picture, but they also might laugh about it and think to themselves, oh, I know people like that. I know aunts and uncles, or perhaps not direct relatives, but other people in society who are adults that I just don't like. And that's the kind of children that those people were. So it gives the child both a kind of incentive to be a good child, but also lets them laugh at the very moralism that's being preached to them. So in that way, the text is doing something rather than just straight moralism that you would have seen in the 18th century. In the 18th century, there was no out for the child. There was no laughing about it. It was all to be taken very seriously. There was no way for the child to imagine themselves as anything other than having a part in this original sin. But in this case, Stevenson is playing with that moralism, but also giving the child another imaginative space to inhabit. So let's look at one other poem by Stevenson, The Land of Nod. From breakfast on through all the day, at home among my friends I stay. But every night I go abroad, afar into the land of Nod. All by myself I have to go, with none to tell me what to do. All alone beside the streams and up the mountainsides of dreams. The strangest things are there for me, both things to eat and things to see, and many frightening sights abroad till morning in the land of Nod. Try as I like to find the way, I never can get back by day, nor can remember plain and clear the curious music that I hear. So, this particular poem is different because it's asking you to think in terms of fantasy. You'll see that there's no moral that's happening at all in that poem. And even though the description is of sleep, obviously a child falling asleep and having dreams is the main action of the poem, it's following a very typical fantasy motif that emerges in the 19th century, particularly in fantasy novels. What you see is that the child is alone without any adults and goes into a new world. While Stevenson's poem is the world of sleep and dreams, in some cases that's true for fantasy and something like Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, but you also have fantasy novels that are just fully immerse you in another world without it being a dream at all. So that movement out of reality into something fantastical is part of fantasy. And the world is pleasurable but also scary. So the description that the child voices in the poem is that this is something that does have threat and darkness to it, but is also a place that is desired and craved by the child and the child wants to get back there even during the daytime. So fantasy can provide that feeling of imaginative pleasure and escape, but also have little consequences to the child's everyday life. And notably, compared to the other poems where Stevenson was kind of winking at the child reader about this harsh moralism, there is no moralism at all in this poem. So the fantasy experience does not have to necessarily have that harsh moralism that we've seen in earlier children's literature. So moving us away from that kind of overt messaging into just the fantasy experience is the trend that I want you to see in these poems, that there's a movement from mimicking and kind of playing with that moralism into just letting go of it completely and letting the child have a pleasurable fantasy experience without really having to apologize for that or having to look for a reason that it happened. It just happened, and it was something that the child loved and wants more of. Let's turn to the story The New Mother by Lucy Clifford. Now, Clifford was a novelist for adults primarily, but like many adult novelists, she also wrote stories for children. And she did write a collection called The Anyhow Stories, Moral and Otherwise, which was published in 1882. Now, the late publication date for the 19th century does mean that she could look back on the developments of children's literature and really respond to its evolution. So children's literature was really having a boom in the 1850s through the 1860s. So you're talking about maybe a generation or so later that she's able to see the success of a lot of different authors and shape her stories accordingly using both a mix of realism and fantasy. What you'll see is that the story of the new mother still contains moralism, but it's presented indirectly through plot development and suspense rather than through that sort of overt moralism that early children's literature might have contained. Importantly, fantasy itself is occurring as a type of punishment here. It is not a vehicle for pleasure or imagination, but instead it's a negative consequence for immoral behavior. So what happens then within the story is that the supernatural is intruding into the reality of the domestic realm. The mother, during the Victorian era in particular, was a very sacred figure. Supposedly, a woman's ideal aspiration would be to become a mother. And children themselves would be really upset by this story of the mother coming in and being replaced by this monstrous figure. But the adults who read it would also be upset. So the story really almost borders on a type of very light horror through the use of fantasy. And you can see the this is contemporary to us, envisioning of what the new mother might have looked like based on the descriptions of the story. This is an illustration here that I found. And you might perhaps most famously know of a similar type of story through the story of Coraline, which has been made into a film. So it's a very similar idea where the mother or the parent is not what they appear to be, or they're replaced by these kind of false, monstrous substitutes. So this idea is kind of latent with the use of fantasy also being a type of horror. What I want us to note is that this horror really arises from the blending of the modes. So the new mother is very eerie, but it is actually completely realistic until the end of the story. So if you're thinking about the actual action of the text with the children going out and meeting someone who's kind of a trickster figure trying to trick them, we don't really know why the girl is trying to make them become naughty, right? There's some mystery to that, but nothing fantastical is shown through her. There's the assumption of the little people dancing, but there's not the actual evidence of it. So everything is about kind of being manipulated, and that's a very realistic, the manipulation of children is a very realistic problem. So what you see in the story is not really anything supernatural, and we're not really sure if the supernatural is actually real or not until we get to the end. And that is where the fantasy comes in, and that kind of abruptness of the fantasy coming into a very realistic setting is what gives the story its final feeling of horror, that actually it is true and that there is this new mother monster who has come in and destroyed the domestic realm. And of course, the moralism being, if only the children had listened, right? If only they had done what was right, then they would not have experienced this monstrosity coming in and destroying their families. So there is that moralism there, but it's not primary, it's more indirect. It's told through plot, it's told through characterization, through mystery and suspense, and that kind of abruptness of the fantasy intruding on the reality through the blending of the modes. So I have a few questions just for us to consider here. I'm not really going to answer all of these, but I think that these are ones that can guide us as we're in this unit on fantasy now, and the way that it's going to be used throughout a variety of different texts. So the first one to think about is fantasy transgressive or dangerous? Does it need to be contained by the real, meaning by truth? Is fantasy left to its own devices something that needs to be feared? Thinking back to the way that children were taught that fantasy had to have all these parameters built in around it, where every allegory is shown, or every fantasy aspect rather, is shown to be an allegory, where every character that might be supernatural is shown to actually not be real and warned off. Do we need to contain fantasy with these sort of truth markers around it in a text? Another question for us to think about is fantasy more effective at teaching moralism than realism is? If we have this kind of fantastical new mother come in to scare everyone at the end, is that actually a more effective way to teach children to have good behavior than to teach them realistic lessons? Finally, is fantasy more pleasurable when it is playful or when it is dark? So do we get a feeling of pleasure from nonsense, or do we like the horror element that comes in? Obviously, this is a matter of taste, but it's something for you to think about in terms of how I want you to think about the structure of the text, right? Not just receiving it and participating in it, but then actually analyzing it for what it is. What is the author doing to make that text more playful or more horrific in this case? How are the blending of the modes actually responsible for the aesthetic effect that you're feeling as you read? When we think about aesthetic effects, I think we often take those things for granted because we're just experiencing them through the pleasure or the frustration of a text. We're not really stepping back from those aesthetic experiences and analyzing them for what they actually are, which is an intentional, oftentimes, constructedness by the author and a result of our own preformed tastes and our cultural environments and a variety of things that shape the way that we read. So I want us to think about that also in the context of something as simple as riddles and rhymes. Those are a very key cornerstone of children's literature. And again, something that I think is often taken for granted and seen as very simple or easy. So when we start out with this discussion of riddles and rhymes, the first thing we need to know is that play as a concept in childhood development and as a concept in children's literature in general is new in the 19th century. This is not something, again, that would have been heard of prior to this idealization of the child that begins in the early Romantic era. So prior, again, to the 1800s, Children are not expected to have this playful, innocent childhood. They're full of sin. They're going to go out to work. They probably won't finish school unless they're extremely upper class, right? So this idea of them being able to have a lot of free time to play is not something that was really realistic, because children at a young age had to help a family earn money. So now, as this concept of childhood shifts, what you have is this movement in terms of the way that learning is conceived. So learning for children should be fun and more pleasurable. It could even include things like humor or nonsense. It doesn't have to be all serious, because childhood itself is becoming more sacred and a space of innocence, and a time when children should be laughing instead of working, and playing instead of going out into the fields to help adults, or being sent to factories in the worst case scenario. So you have to think of how these historical and conceptual components were also influencing the way that people were composing literature. I want us to distinguish between riddles and rhymes now, to think about how these two different types of literature really became literature, first of all, and how they were constructed for a child's point of view during the 19th century. So riddles in particular were not necessarily a child's form. They tended to be circulated in adult circles as well, and they draw on logic and lived experience. So in that sense, they are realistic in mode. In order to decipher a riddle, you have to understand what objects exist in the world, what experiences can be had by people, and be able to put these different things together to, if you will, deduct the answer, right? Thinking about how detective fiction is a type of realist fiction, right? That you're going to move from one clue to the next clue to figure out the truth that's at the end. Riddles are working the same way. They're short, they're condensed, but they're still asking you to piece together clues to figure out an answer. So in that sense, they are realistic. The biggest difference, though, is that riddles are not used for moralism. Instead, they're just purely for entertainment, just like this new mode of fantasy literature for children that's going to emphasize play and pleasure. Riddles are just for fun, even for adults. They're just little clues that people like to hand one another, that can be deciphered as almost like a parlor game or a trick, just for pleasure. So riddles have this background of realism, but they also are realism with pleasure embedded. Nursery rhymes were originally oral songs that were passed down through different families. Many were published in the 18th and 19th centuries for the first time. So these particular rhymes are going to be different than riddles, because they're not really emphasizing the uncovering of truth. Instead, they rely more on sound and form. So think about Coleridge's emphasis on pleasure and the aesthetic experience of language over truth. Rhymes are going to have this key quality, and that the way that they sound is going to be more important than what they mean. So they contain fantasy, they contain nonsense, but they're also just for fun, in the same way that riddles are. Now, most nursery rhymes are some of the first type of children's literature that children are introduced to, even today. The Mother Goose rhymes are probably the most familiar, and I've listed a few of these out. Little Bo Peep, Three Blind Mice, Jack and Jill. These are ones that most children are going to hear of at some point during their childhood, either through family or eventually as they get introduced to school rhymes. Some of these might come up, or even in animated films or things. Some of these figures from these nursery rhymes might appear now. I did include a couple that are less traditional so that you could try to notice more of the silly words, the rhyming, the grotesque, and especially the lack of morals that are more typical for nursery rhymes. So these types of rhymes, again, are privileging the sound of the language and the experience of nonsense over any sort of moralism or truth. So just to read a couple of the ones that you had for this week. There was an old woman called Nothing at All, who rejoiced in a dwelling exceedingly small. A man stretched his mouth to his utmost extent, and down at one gulp, house and old woman went. So there's really not a meaning here, right? There's just a nice old lady. She doesn't even have a name. I have to think, just based on the history of it, that calling her Nothing at All is intentional to undo any sort of moralism that could be there, right? That there's this sense where we're not going to name her Fairy Do-Good because we're not going to give her any characteristics that could have any kind of moralness to them. Instead, she's just called Nothing at All. She's just living in her tiny house, and a guy comes by and somehow managed to swallow her and the house. There's a grotesqueness to it. You could see this in a sort of silly horror type way, and for example, some kind of animated cartoon where he could stretch his mouth huge and it would be ridiculous and weird, and then swallowing her down and killing her, right? There's this strangeness to it, but there's no moral at all. It's just silly, it's rhyming, there's pleasure to it. A child can laugh at it and think, how weird, and then move on without learning anything from it. In the same way, you have this other rhyme: 3 wise men of Gotham went to sea in a bowl. If the bowl had been stronger, my song would have been longer. Again, 3 supposedly wise men go out to sea and they die. There's that dark undertone that will surprise child readers, that will make them laugh, but it's not really teaching them a lesson. Perhaps we could squeeze a lesson of being prepared when you go out on a journey if we really wanted to make that a moral, but it's not really implicitly or explicitly moralistic. It's just for fun. For the examples of the riddles, I've actually taken a few from John Cotton, who lived during the 20th century and not the 19th century, just to give you an example of ones that you could actually solve or even write yourself today. So these particular riddles are ones that are written and treasured both by adults and children. They're actually from a children's literature anthology, so directed towards children, but actually still enjoyed by adults as well. And I can read a few of these out here, but I'm not going to solve them for you because part of this week's discussion is for you to think about what the answers might be, drawing on your own experience, thinking about what is real in the world, combining that with imagination, and then figuring out what the answer might be. So one of the ones that I really enjoy is number 2. We are a crystal zoo, wielders of fortunes, the top of our professions. Like hard silver nails hammered into the dark, we made charts for mariners. I think that one is pretty obvious. Maybe it's not. It seemed very obvious to me. So think about maybe 1 or 2 that you might like to solve, and think about what you're drawing on as you solve those, what kind of real world knowledge that you already have. I wanted to also, just to connect it more to the 19th century, remind you that there's a very famous 19th century riddle, or called a charade, in Jane Austen's text Emma, where Emma and Harriet are collecting actually a book of riddles, and Mr. Elton sends a romantic one to Emma, who assumes it's for Harriet, and it becomes this plot point. So if you're not familiar with Jane Austen's Emma, that actually is something that is directed towards adults, and then in the text, the riddle is for adults. It's a romantic riddle. So these types of riddles, again, were not necessarily always children's literature, but they were still a point of connection between adults and children as adults were reading these riddles, these new ones that were being written for children, and able to kind of participate in them as well. So it was a family type of experience. So with this background of riddles and rhymes and children's moralism and the evolution of the concept of childhood, we finally get to the most famous children's writer of the Victorian era, and that is Lewis Carroll. So Alice's Adventures in Wonderland is largely seen as the beginning of the golden age in Victorian children's literature. So other texts obviously existed before and alongside this text, but none has been as popular or as enduring or had as much cultural impact as this particular book and its sequel, which we read from Through the Looking Glass. So it's most famous for its nonsense, but that nonsense relies on understanding the real world. So it turns proper Victorian morals upside down in order to mock them, and it's written for readers' pleasure. But you have to actually understand the real world and understand the context of Victorian society in order to get the nonsense jokes. So in the way, again, it's this blending of modes that happens where in order to really get what's happening in Wonderland, you have to understand the reality of what's happening in England. And therefore, when it becomes nonsensical, it's even more funny because you get the joke. So Carroll is requiring you to use that real world knowledge just like riddles do in order to get the nonsense that you might see in rhymes. I asked you to read chapter 6 from Through the Looking Glass, the sequel to Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. And the reason that I picked this particular chapter is because she's learning how to read fantasy, meaning interpret fantasy. And to get into Wonderland this time, she goes through the looking glass, so through the mirror. And the mirror itself is depicted as transforming or interpreting reality and not showing the truth. So it's this portal into another world, but it's also twisting or reflecting back a different version of what is real. So you can think of it how if you look in an actual mirror, it's showing you something that is real, but it's also actually not real, right? It's an illusion of what is real. So I think that Carroll is intentionally playing with this mirror as a metaphor, particularly because, as we'll see in our study of realism in our next unit, that the metaphor of realist authors was that a text was supposed to be like a mirror, showing the world an exact copy of what it actually is. But I think Carroll understood, even from the very beginning of when writers were trying to use this metaphor, that the mirror is not an exact copy. It can be a portal, it can transform, it can reflect back things but that look real but that have a significant difference as well. So Alice goes into Wonderland through the looking glass this time, and a lot of what happens in the text kind of twists and plays with what reality is in England versus what Alice sees it to be in Wonderland. So this chapter in particular is a commentary on writing, on learning, and on interpretation. Now, although I don't have this mentioned on the slides for you, I hope you did notice the context that when Alice meets Humpty Dumpty, the immediate form that the conversation takes is first in terms of riddles. So Humpty Dumpty thinks that she's asking him riddles, and he's going to figure out how to respond, but he does so in these kind of absurdist ways. So she's trying to just have a normal conversation, but he's actually turning that into a riddle and using that kind of form of the riddle that we've been talking about to try to control the conversation. You also see later in the chapter where they're trying to interpret nonsense rhymes, the Jabberwocky poem, and then eventually he recites his own rhyme that's just complete and total nonsense. So there's this issue, I think, where Carroll is very aware of these other 19th century forms of the riddle and the rhyme, and he's taking these things into Wonderland and showing both their pleasure and their absurdity in some ways, and kind of playing with how those things, what do those things look like if we put them into play and as types of narrative conversation. There are a lot of things that are going on in this chapter like that, just these kind of throwaway allusions to rhymes and riddles and their place in conversation and culture. But I want to draw your attention to just a couple of points here. First of all, Humpty Dumpty asks Alice what her name is, and she responds, and he's kind of like, oh, that's a weird name. And they have this conversation about, does a name have to mean something? And really what's at the bottom of this is questioning assumptions about language's purpose. So does a name have to mean something? And he's saying, yes, my name means the way that I look, right? That I'm Humpty Dumpty, and this is the way that I look. And your name doesn't have that same meaning. It doesn't tell me anything about the way that you look. So he's saying language needs to have a literal purpose, not a symbolic purpose, not a metaphorical purpose, the way that we might think of names now, but that language should be descriptive in some way. And you see that played out in the translation process of the Jabberwocky poem as well, that he's taking the sounds of the words and trying to describe what they literally could look like in the world. He also takes her questions very literally, like when she says, why do you sit there all alone? He says, because there's no one with me. Right? So he's not interpreting or making her language symbolic in any way. And he's drawing attention to the way that we actually do this quite often. We use context, we use allusions, we use metaphors constantly in the way that we speak with one another. But he's refusing to play that game. So what's happening here is that this use of fantasy is allowing Carroll, as the author, to manipulate these conventions and expectations about language that we take for granted. It's really showing that instability of how we speak and the way that language works and the way that it functions. And Alice frequently says, oh, I thought you meant this. And Humpty Dumpty responds, if I meant it, I would have said it. right? I would have said it directly. So stop making assumptions about what I mean, because he is a literal speaker. He's not trying to use allusions. He's not trying to use context clues, right? He's trying to say, if I meant it, I would have said it. And language means what I say it means. And he brings up these kind of problems of interpretation that underlie language's structure, but that in conversation we don't really ever pay attention to. And so by using nonsense, Carroll is able to draw our attention to this really kind of interesting philosophical question that underlies the whole system of language. So I'll read this one little section that exemplifies that problem. Alice says, I don't know what you mean by glory. Humpty Dumpty smiled contemptuously. Of course you don't, till I tell you. I meant there's a knockdown argument for you. But glory doesn't mean a nice knockdown argument, Alice objected. When I use a word, Humpty Dumpty said in a rather scornful tone, it means just what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less. The question is, said Alice, whether you can make words mean so many different things. The question is, said Humpty Dumpty, which is to be master. That's all. And Carroll doesn't really answer what Humpty Dumpty means even in this, right? Humpty is basically saying that he gets to be the one to control the meaning, that it's his individual decision about what a word means, when in fact the way language operates is that it's consensual meaning, that we all agree that the word blue means this certain color that we have all learned it to be. And if I start saying, no, that's actually red, then I'm saying that I control the meaning of the word red and the meaning of the word blue, and I'm refusing to actually engage with societal conventions and with tradition and with learned behaviors and expectations, and even on some level with objective reality out there. If I refuse to agree with what everyone says is real, then I'm creating my own type of reality where words mean different things. This is really a big philosophical issue that's at stake behind this play of nonsense that Carroll has created. So Alice is questioning this. Is it actually possible to change the meanings of words? And you get this played out through this process of interpretation of the poem Jabberwocky, where nonsense words are giving meaning based on association and context. So they go through this process where she says, help me understand this. And he says, okay, quote it to me. She only gets out the first stanza, and then they go through and say, well, what does this mean? And what does this mean? And there's this kind of almost nonsensical process of almost mocking what English majors would do in terms of deciphering the context and the meaning of different words and symbols within a poem, right? That we're just kind of, Carroll seems to be suggesting that people are just making up things, right? That there's this kind of nonsenseness under critique through nonsense, I should say, this process of interpretation of how we make meaning and how we build knowledge, that Carroll is mocking this in some ways, that we could work together to try to figure out what 'twas brillig and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wabe means. And we could just try to figure out what that means, but maybe it's just nonsense words, and maybe we can't actually extract any meaning out of it. So I think in this kind of world of fantasy that is Wonderland, the question is being raised, what does it mean to mean something? When everything is nonsense, can meaning even be possible? And really, should meaning or truth even be our primary aesthetic goal? And you see this played out, this last question, in the conclusion of Humpty Dumpty's poem. He goes on, and he's kind of just, shouting at one point, shouting this rhyme, which I just love this scene because I love this idea of Humpty Dumpty the egg just screaming poetry at Alice, and she's just kind of like, what is going on? So he gets to the end, and I won't scream it, but he's saying, and when I found the door was locked, I pushed and pulled and pushed and knocked. And when I found the door was shut, I tried to turn the handle, but... And that's the end. There's no meaning to it. There's no conclusion to it. Why did he tell her this? We don't know. She says, is that all? And he just says, that's all. Goodbye. And dismisses her, right? So there's no sense of closure. It's just words for the sake of words. It's just nonsense. And I think that this is Carroll's way of playing with our desire for truth, playing with this feeling that we have to have some kind of final outcome, some kind of moral, some answer to the riddle, something that is going to satisfy our curiosity and give us pleasure and closure. And he's saying, actually, if you take away all this consensus around language, language itself is just nonsense. We've all agreed that things are going to mean a certain way, but if somebody comes along like Humpty Dumpty and says, I'm not going to play this game with you anymore, I'm not going to participate in your language system anymore, then everything just kind of self-destructs, really. And all you have is nonsense language, and it really kind of deconstructs and destabilizes the whole way that we search for meaning and the whole process of interpretation. So even though we have this as a children's book and we can read it just for pleasure and we can read it just for this nonsensical experience, what you see is that Carroll is really providing a type of social critique that an adult can understand embedded within this nonsensical deconstruction of language that Humpty Dumpty is undertaking. So as a way to wrap this all up, I want us to ask the question, is children's literature really just a question of reading for fun? So I have that question mark on there intentionally. We've talked about how Victorian children's literature is really beginning to prioritize pleasure instead of truth. And this is leading to the use of increased fantasy in children's literature, that there should be more play, more nonsense, more emphasis on letting go of this harsh moralism. But we have to also remember the context of culture as a whole. So fantasy is still viewed as something secondary to realism in the larger culture. So there's this division where texts that are for kids and not for adults are less serious. So you can think about Carroll writing something like this Humpty Dumpty rhyme and embedding this incredible philosophical problem about language into it, but it's still being marketed and sold to kids who probably won't really get that type of critique. And in fact, many adults won't get that type of critique from that scene. So even though adults are reading them to children, they're not the primary audience. And we have authors kind of dealing or wrestling with this concept of what can I do with fantasy? Do I want it to be disruptive and transgressive? Do I want to use it for moralism? Do I want to just target it to children? Do I want to include social critiques or philosophical critiques in my fantasy literature? How am I going to make anything mean anything if there's this wealth of possibilities and really unlimited possibilities in the fantasy world? So interpretation itself becomes even more important when reading fantasy because overt moralism is being abandoned, right? We're not going to have these harsh morals in every sense of the tale. We're going to have more psychological complexity. We're not going to have an intrusive narrator that's telling us what to think. And then we possibly won't even know the meaning of some types of language or fantasy structures. So if there is no moralism and there's no narrator and the reader is kind of left to unravel these riddles of the text and decide what the fantasy experience means, then it becomes more complicated, right? It becomes maybe not just for children, even though it's being marketed to children, that there's a sense where the reader is left a little bit to their own devices and has to struggle a little bit more because not everything is so literally laid out in ways that are expected and understood. And you're going to see this problem of interpretation with fantasy literature come up in the longer texts that we read for the next couple of weeks, George MacDonald's Fantasties. So keep this context in mind that authors, even though they're talking and writing to children, are still grappling with these larger philosophical issues that are at stake that deal with language, interpretation, and aesthetic experience.